If you're a climber confused by all the information out there about finger strength training, this video is for you. What's up everybody and welcome back. This video aims to demonstrate the similarities and the differences between commonly used finger strength training methods. We will also demonstrate how to quickly identify the appropriate loads for each method by testing with the Tindeq Progressor. If you still need to familiarize yourself with different testing methods, I suggest you watch the previous video first. As discussed in the previous video, strength training the fingers off the climbing wall aims to increase muscle size, muscle recruitment, and connective tissue stiffness. To do this effectively, we need to first understand the athlete's current peak force, or what is commonly referred to as their 1 repetition max. Even though climbers aren't completing a full range of motion movement, like we do in a pull-up or a deadlift, the maximum load added when hanging, or the maximum force produced when pulling for 2 to 4 seconds should be considered their 1 repetition maximum. This is a slightly different but essential distinction from finding the load an athlete can hang with for 7 to 10 seconds. The research has shown that the latter increases athlete stamina more than it does peak force. Indeed, increasing stamina of the fingers is helpful for our sport, but as suggested in the first video and what we'll demonstrate in subsequent videos, building stamina on the climbing wall is a more transferable adaptation than doing it on a fingerboard. For the testing and training portions of the video, I'll use the Tindeq Progressor and these available training tools: a 25mm tension climbing block, an Unlevel MetaCarp edge, and a rounded tension climbing hold attached to the grip bowl from Beast Fingers Climbing. When analyzing the research on finger strength training, we see a wide range of edge sizes used. However, the recent literature suggests using larger edges to increase peak vertical forces. In most cases, the athlete self-selects between an open and a half crimp grip for edges up to 30mm. And when training the full crimp position, the optimal edge size is likely 20mm. I suggest using the half crimp or slightly obtuse half crimp position instead of the open-handed position. The non-climbing literature on isometric contractions demonstrates that larger joint angle isometrics tend to produce less force, create more muscle damage, and fatigue more quickly. That is not the goal of a finger strength training program. Remember, for the specific adaptations we want to gain off the wall, it likely doesn't matter which one of these methods you use as long as the stimulus hits the right intensity and the fatigue is minimized. These gains will only transfer to rock climbing by climbing and being more intentional with our grip training practices on the climbing wall. In the first example in this video, I will use an overcoming style isometric to measure the fingers in isolation by curling down on 2 separate edges. In the second example, I will use a yielding style isometric to measure how much load the fingers can resist when pulling and pushing with the upper body and legs. Then we will repeat that same order while curling and pulling from the ground. Just a quick heads up, this video is skipping an adequate finger warm-up. That has already been completed and discussed in the previous video. We will not be demonstrating that again here. In this first example, I will sit with my arm fully extended overhead, fingers in a slightly obtuse half crimp position, and curl the fingers into the unlevel edge at max effort. I will repeat 2 to 3 max efforts per arm with 30 seconds of rest between efforts on the same side and use the highest force per arm as my maximum for that day. Today, my maximum isolated finger force was 134 pounds for the right and 129 pounds for the left. Adding them together, I have a 2-arm sum of 263 pounds and a strength-to-weight ratio of 1.6. Using the same position and protocol while curling the fingers into a 25mm edge at max effort, my maximum isolated finger force was 116 pounds for the right and 115 pounds for the left. Adding them together, I have a 2-arm sum of 231 pounds, around a 13% difference, and a strength-to-weight ratio of 1.4. As you can see, the unlevel edge increases force production by allowing more effort through the index and pinky fingers. An important note: if measuring forces this way, I wouldn't use these numbers to load on a fingerboard. As discussed in the previous video, these numbers underestimate the loads I could tolerate on a fingerboard because of the muscle contraction type. If I use this method as my training intervention, which is a good idea, I will need to use the Tindeq to measure each repetition while overloading only the finger flexors. But we'll get to that later. Because we are already set up in this position, let's demonstrate the yielding isometric test with 3 separate edges. For this version of the test, I must bend my arm, lock the hips down, and use my upper body to pull the fingers at maximum effort. As with the curling method, I will repeat 2 to 3 max efforts per arm with a 30-second rest between efforts on the same side and use the highest force per arm as my maximum for that day. Let's first test these numbers pulling on the unlevel edge at max effort. On this day, my maximum yielding force was 181 pounds for the right and 181 pounds for the left. Adding them together, my 2-arm sum is 362 pounds, giving me a strength-to-weight ratio of 2.26. As you can see, the difference in force between curling down and pulling down is around 30%, consistent with the difference between concentric and eccentric loads. Now let's do the same test on the 25mm edge. When using the same position and pulling on the 25mm edge at max effort, my yielding force was 170 pounds for the right and 176 pounds for the left. Adding them together, my 2-arm sum is 346 pounds, giving me a strength-to-weight ratio of 2.1. As we'd expect, the difference in force between curling and pulling on a 25mm edge is around 34%. Now let's do a final test with the Talon grip. In this last example, I'll use the same position, pulling on a tension ball at max effort with my fingers separated. On this day, my yielding force was 133 pounds for the right and 136 pounds for the left. Adding them together, my 2-arm sum is 269 pounds, giving me the lowest yielding strength-to-weight ratio of 1.68. I can't compare the curling method for the Talon grip because I can't perform that test with the current tools available. Now that I've completed the yielding tests, I can use the numbers to estimate the loads when hanging on the fingers. These forces and loads are similar to the contraction type used on a fingerboard. Remember, they are around 30% more load than the finger flexor muscles can actually produce. That's because of the extra tolerance muscles have during an eccentric-like contraction. Using my unlevel edge numbers to load on a fingerboard, I'll use the whetstone hangboard created by Tension Climbing. To get the training load, I would multiply my 2-arm sum, 362 pounds, by 0.85. That number represents 85% of my 1 repetition maximum and equals 307 pounds. Then I'll take that number, 307, and subtract my body weight, which is 160, giving me an added load of around 150 pounds. That example represents my 2-arm training load, but I could also do it with 1 arm to make it a little bit easier. Because my strength-to-weight ratio on that edge is right around my body weight, I could simplify my training by doing the same intervention with 1 arm at a time at body weight or slightly lower than body weight if I wanted to increase the volume. Now let's see how those training numbers are applied to a 25mm tension grindstone edge. To get these training loads, I would multiply my 2-arm sum, 346, by 0.85. That number represents 85% of my 1 rep max and equals 294 pounds. Then I'll take that number, 294, and subtract my body weight, which is 160, giving me an added load of around 140 pounds. As with the unlevel edge, that example represents my 2-arm training load, but I could also do it with 1 arm to make the setup a little bit easier. If I were performing training sets on the tension balls with the Talon grip, I would multiply my 2-arm sum, 269, by 0.85. Again, that number represents 85% of my 1 rep max. I'll take that number, subtract my body weight, giving me an added load of 70 pounds. Because there's no fingerboard with circular shaped holds, I typically use the tension balls that are common to many campus board setups in gyms around the world. Now that you're familiar with the curling and pulling down methods, let's demonstrate how to test and utilize the loads when curling and pulling from the ground. We will maintain the same order as the pulling down version in this example for clarity. In this first example, I will stand on top of the platform with my arm fully extended in front of my body, fingers in a slightly obtuse half crimp position, and curl my body into the ground with the unlevel edge at max effort. I will repeat 2 to 3 max efforts per arm with 30 seconds of rest between efforts on the same side, and use the highest force per arm as my maximum for that day. On this day, my maximum isolated finger force on an unlevel edge was 123 pounds for the right and 127 pounds for the left. Adding them together, I have a 2-arm sum of 250 pounds and a strength-to-weight ratio of 1.5. Note how similar these numbers are to the curling down method. The slight variation in force would be considered normal because these tests were done on separate days. Using the same position and protocol while curling the fingers into a 25mm edge at max effort, my maximum isolated finger force was 112 pounds for the right and 113 pounds for the left. Adding them together, my 2-arm sum is 225 pounds and around a 10% difference, and a strength-to-weight ratio of 1.4. As you can see, again, the unlevel edge increases force production by allowing more effort through the index and pinky fingers. Something to remember, if measuring peak forces this way, there should not be a significant difference between this method and the curling down method. I also wouldn't use these numbers to load on a fingerboard. Because we're already set up in this position, let's demonstrate the pulling up or yielding isometric test with 3 separate edges. For this version of the test, I must keep the arm straight, bend the knees, and use my legs to push on the fingers at maximum effort. As with the curling method, I will repeat 2 to 3 max efforts per arm with 30 seconds of rest between efforts on the same side, and use the highest force per arm as my maximum for that day. Once again, let's test these numbers while pulling up on the unlevel edge at max effort first. On this day, my maximum yielding force was 186 pounds for the right and 176 pounds for the left. Adding them together, my 2-arm sum is 359, giving me a strength-to-weight ratio of 2.24. On this day, the difference in force between curling and pulling from the ground is 30% and the same as the pulling down method. When using the same position and pulling up on the 25mm edge at max effort, my yielding force was 172 for the right and 173 for the left. Adding them together, my 2-arm sum is 345, giving me a strength-to-weight ratio slightly lower at 2.1. As we'd expect, the difference in force between curling and pulling on a 25mm edge is still 35% and is the same as pulling down on a 25mm edge. Now let's demonstrate one final test with the Talon grip. In this last example, I'll use the same position, pulling up on a tension ball at max effort with my fingers separated. On this day, my yielding force was 125 pounds for the right and 126 pounds for the left. Adding them together, my 2-arm sum is 261, giving me still the lowest yielding strength-to-weight ratio of 1.56. If you've stuck with me this far, thanks. I understand that was a bunch of testing numbers and me pulling on things. Now we're moving on to the most critical part of this video. That is, understanding how to use the training numbers to improve finger strength off the wall. I aim to demonstrate how these different strength training methods will produce the same outcome as long as we follow proper strength training principles. As mentioned in the previous video, using the overcoming style isometric, either curling down or curling up, first makes the most sense. The intention is to activate as many motor units as possible in the finger flexors while minimizing the reliance on passive tension. Active tension will improve passive tension and usually not the other way around. To train with this method, I will use the Tindeq Progressor and target 80 to 85% of my peak force every rep within 2 to 4 seconds. The goal is to hit that peak force repeatedly over 3 to 5 reps each set, with a 2 to 3 minute rest between sets and completing around 3 to 5 sets per session. Because my concern is hitting that peak force, Once I attain it and sustain it briefly, I can back off before the next repetition. First, let's see what a set would look like curling down on the unlevel edge. My curling down maximum with the right arm was 134 and the left arm was 129. So I aim to do multiple repetitions at around 113 pounds of force on the right and 109 to 110 pounds on the left. If I contrast that with curling down on the 25mm edge, my curling down maximum with the right arm was 116 and with the left arm was 115 pounds. So I aim to do multiple repetitions at around 98 to 100 pounds on both arms. If you prefer to train with the curling up method on the unlevel edge, my maximum on the right was 123 and my maximum on the left was 127. So I aim to do multiple repetitions at around the same 104 pounds of force on the right and 109 pounds of force on the left. But remember, these were tested on separate days, so the difference would be considered normal. If I was curling up on the 25mm edge, my maximum on the right arm was 113 pounds, and with the left arm was 112 pounds. So I aim to do multiple repetitions at around the same 100 pounds of force on either arm. But again, these were tested on separate days, so the difference would be considered normal. As noted in our previous video, these are not the only methods of curling the fingers into an edge. The overcoming style isometric can also be done horizontally against a fixed object or with the elbow locked in place by a table or a custom device. It does not matter which one you use so long as the intention is the same. Now that we have established how to train recruitment with the overcoming style isometrics, let's talk about how to use the yielding loads to train on and off the fingerboard. As demonstrated, yielding style isometrics, either pulling down, pulling up, or on a fingerboard, should be around 30 to 40% more load than the muscles can actually produce. The intention is still to activate as many motor units as possible, but also load the connective tissues that attach to the ends of each muscle fiber. The principles of this style of strength training are the same. It's the load and the intention that are different. I will still target 80 to 85% of my peak force, whether an external load or pulling against the Tindeq, every rep within 2 to 4 seconds. The goal is to hit that force repeatedly over 3 to 5 reps every set, with a 2 to 3 minute rest between, and completing around 3 to 5 sets per session. Because my concern is hitting that peak force, once I attain it and sustain it briefly, I can back off before the next repetition. Now we are going to demonstrate pulling down and up against a scale, lifting a load off the ground, and using a fingerboard with the yielding style isometric. I intend to demonstrate how all these loads on the fingers are very similar, and for the most part, it likely doesn't matter which one you do, as long as you get the intensity right with the tool you're using. For the sake of video length, I will only show the yielding training options for the 25mm edge and the Talon grip. But note that these would also apply for the unlevel edge. If I was to train strength by pulling down on the 25mm edge, my pulling maximum with the right arm was 170 pounds, and with the left arm was 176 pounds. So I aim to do multiple repetitions at around 150 pounds of force on each arm for every rep. When using a strain gauge for training, the best practice is to end each set when I can no longer hit that peak force target. That is auto-regulation at its finest. If I wanted to train strength by pulling up on the 25mm edge, I would do the same thing, but use a different position. My numbers were close enough, so I'd aim to do multiple repetitions at around 150 pounds of force on each hand for every rep. Again, when using a strain gauge for training, the best practice is to end each set when I can no longer hit that peak force target. Again, that is the whole point of auto-regulating with a strain gauge. If I wanted to train by lifting something off the ground on a 25mm edge, I would use those same numbers. I would attach 150 pounds to a loading pin, and I would lift it off the ground for 2 to 3 seconds each rep. Because I can't auto-regulate the rep length, I want to pay attention to the intention of each effort to try and end the set when I encounter fatigue. In this case, I do an even number of reps on each arm before taking a 2 to 3 minute rest and repeat that same effort or slightly adjust the weight for subsequent sets. Similarly, I could use those numbers and add weight to my body on a 25mm edge with 2 arms. In this example, I would attach 135 to 150 pounds to a loading pin and lift my feet off the ground for 2 to 3 seconds each rep. Because I can't auto-regulate the rep length, I want to pay attention to the intention of each effort to try and end the set when I encounter fatigue. After each set, I'd take 2 to 3 minutes rest and repeat that same effort or slightly adjust the weight. And lastly, because my testing numbers are right around my body weight, I could use my body weight or take a little bit off on a 25mm edge with 1 arm at a time. In this example, I would lift my feet off the ground for 2 to 3 seconds each rep. Now let's see what a setup would look like pulling down with the Talon grip. My pulling down maximum with the right arm was 133 pounds, and with the left arm was 136 pounds. So I aim to do multiple repetitions at around 113 pounds of force for each arm. As mentioned, when using a strain gauge for training, the best practice is to end each set when I can no longer hit that peak force target. If I wanted to train by pulling up with the Talon grip, my pulling up maximum on the right was 125 and 126 with the left arm. So I aim to do multiple repetitions at around 106 pounds of force for each arm and end the set when I can no longer hit that peak force target. If we contrast that training method with lifting something off the ground on a rounded edge, I would use those numbers, attach 110 pounds to a loading pin, and lift it off the ground for 2 to 3 seconds every rep. Because I can't auto-regulate the rep length, I want to pay attention to the intention of each effort to try and end the set when I encounter fatigue. In this case, I do an even number of reps on each arm before taking a 2 to 3 minute rest and repeating that same effort or slightly adjust the weight. Similarly, I could use those numbers and add weight to my body on a campus board with the tension balls with 2 arms. In this example, I would attach 50 pounds to a loading pin, lift my feet off the ground for 2 to 3 seconds every rep. As you can see with these different strength training methods, the principles and the adaptations are the same. It's only the body position and the methodology that's different. Having so much redundancy in this video ensures you understand that the outcomes of all these different types of off-the-wall training should be very similar. Let's finish this video by revisiting the goals with finger strength training off the wall. Goal number 1 is to increase the size and the recruitment of the extrinsic and the intrinsic muscles of the hands and fingers. To do this, we need the intensity to be high and progressively overloaded. Goal number 2 is to increase connective tissue stiffness. High-intensity loads require more intention than low-intensity loads. This intention naturally increases the rate of force production. High-intensity, high-rate loads have been shown to increase the material stiffness of connective tissue. And lastly, goal number 3 is to increase the quality of climbing practice. Because finger strength training will not make you climb harder, we want to use it to improve the quality of more intense practice for ourselves or our athletes. Remember, you should spend more time gaining coordination and positional stiffness on a climbing wall, not a fingerboard. Now my final recommendations for this video. Pick a preferred method to overload the fingers in isolation at the beginning of your climbing day or finger training session. For this, I would use an Unlevel edge. After the motor units are activated, overload the connective tissues by pulling or pushing with your arms and legs on a 25 to 30mm edge. If you are warming up for a project outside with some small edges, do a few crimp yielding style isometrics on a 10 or an 8mm edge. As we mentioned in the previous video, that is likely enough finger strength training for a climbing athlete. If you're in season, we want to use that high stimulus as the primary method of maintaining stiffness and recruitment in the fingers before every climbing session. In the next video, I'll discuss how you can gain a better transfer to the climbing wall by intentionally spending more time on smaller edges. This is similar but distinct from hanging on minimal edges on a fingerboard. Please leave your comments and questions below. One of my coaches or myself will get to them as quickly as possible. Be sure to follow and like this video, share it with your friends, and follow our other social accounts. If you're interested in the Tindeq Progressor, the MetaCarp Edge, or doing a consultation with anyone on my team, I'll attach the links in the description below. Also, remember to use the discount code C4HP at checkout. See you in the next video.